Welcome to Forensic Perspectives, the legal community's online resource for the latest in forensic accounting, business valuation, and financial litigation support. Your host for this podcast is Mark Gottlieb. In addition to being a certified public accountant, Mark has also obtained many professional accreditations in forensic accounting and business valuation. As one of the Tri-State's leading financial experts, Mark is also a frequent lecturer and writer. Without any further ado, please welcome the host of Forensic Perspectives, Mark Gottlieb.
Thank you, and welcome to today's program. Uncovering and understanding hidden fees in 401k plans is more important than ever. The Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, requires that a plan's fiduciaries manage the plan for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits to plan participants and beneficiaries. This means that the cost of providing a plan must be known and monitored on an ongoing basis. Unfortunately, the compensation and benefits environment is different today, as high-profile scandals have given great concern to employer plan sponsors, participants and government regulators, including and not limited to the Department of Labor. Currently, there are more than a dozen class action suits asserting ERISA breach of fiduciary duty against board of directors of Fortune 500 companies for failure to identify undisclosed 401k plans and monitor the reasonableness of plan expenses. Today, our guest is Miriam Schindel. Ms. Schindel is Special Counsel to the law firm Hinman, Howard & Kattell, whose offices are located in White Plains, New York. Miriam is an employment attorney specializing in employee benefits and executive compensation. She is also an author of a book entitled Use of Compulsory Lie Detector Tests in Arbitration, and has also co-edited a number of treatises. Miriam, good morning, and welcome to our show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Let's go back for a second to those giddy days in the 1980s when 401k balances were soaring in tandem with the stock values and the stock market overall. At that time, the impact of fees did not really draw widespread notice outside the ranks of fiduciaries. Miriam, what's happened in the last 10 years that has caused there to be a closer scrutiny and the impact of these fees?
Well, Mark, there are a variety of reasons why 401k fees have been on the radar screen recently. First, over the last 20 years, there's been a considerable shift in the types of plans being offered by employers to employees. There's been this movement away from defined benefit pension plans to the 401k plan. Employees in these 401k plans bear the sole responsibility for funding their retirement. In fact, many employers now structure their plans as 404c plans. That means self-directed plans, where the employee has the burden to select the fund from maybe half a dozen to 20 different funds or family of funds, and to select which funds that he or she will invest in. With that shift in the employer obligation, there's been a duty by the employer to provide education, daily record-keeping access, and voice response systems. So you have a new operational platform that's developed technologically, and along with that comes the cost for that new platform. That's the shift that's gone over to the employee, and the employee bears that cost. So that's one thing. Second thing is that a couple of years ago, the LA Times investigated 401k fees, and they found that participants were losing as much as 28% of their investment returns by way of fee costs. And these fees were largely hidden from view. The LA Times expose was the impetus for congressional hearings, and those were spearheaded by Congressman George Miller, who at the time was chair of the House Education and Labor Committee. He authored a bill called the Fair Disclosure and Pension Security Act, and that required all 401k fund managers and employers to make sure that the fund managers broke down the fees that they charged into understandable categories, such as fees for administration, fees for investment management, transaction-based fees, and so on. But unfortunately, this bill has been battered and bruised as it's went its way through Congress. Most recently, the bill was included in the American Jobs and Closing Tax Loopholes Act of 2010. The Senate Committee on Finance, through Max Baucus, tabled the 401k fee provisions, and we are where we were 5 years ago. So in the end, participants must rely on what their employers tell them in order to decide whether they are investing in low-fee funds or high-fee funds, or whether there are hidden fees at all.
When the LA Times did their article about these fees, was it that these fees were always being charged and now first being noticed, or was this something that was new and they picked up on it?
Let me say two things. The fees, investment management fees, have always been charged. Administration fees have always been charged and have been passed along to the plan participants. However, the amount of fees, and the nature of those fees, and the fee sharing arrangements that fund managers and trustees and custodians have with one another probably is something that developed in the 80s and the 90s, and we're not always there. And as you started out by saying, the giddy days of the 80s and 90s, these fees, while they may range between 3 to 5%, in some instances even as high as 7%, depending on the nature of the fund, went ignored largely because everybody was making money. But when you're not making money, or you see your account balance spiraling downward, the fees take a more prominent place.
Were they not disclosed or ignored? There's a difference, isn't there?
Well, they were not disclosed, and in those instances where they might have been disclosed or available in the prospectus, for example, they were ignored.
You know, there's a gentleman, David Huntley, who's a principal at HR Investment Consultants, which is a firm that focuses on retirement plans, and he was quoted in a recent article, and he said, quote, "The only reason fees and expenses are hidden is because managers choose not to look deeply enough for them." Would you agree with that statement?
Yes and no, Mark. As I said earlier, it's not entirely a question of not looking deeply enough at a plan's fees. It's just that there are so many types of hidden fees, and an employer not versed in this area would really need to get outside expert help to figure out what the fees are and whether they violate ERISA's prohibited transaction rules or the rules of prudency and for the exclusive benefit of plan participants. Let me give you an example of some of these hidden fees. You've got the portfolio turnover. Now, we're all aware that in order for a fund manager to be successful in delivering a net asset return that's competitive or better than market, he has to take a look at the portfolio periodically and buy and sell. The average actively traded mutual fund has about an 80% turnover per year, but actually many mutual funds have as high as 200 to 300% turnover. There is a hidden fee associated with that turnover, and that's in the brokerage commissions. For every 1% in turnover, there's an addition of 1% in brokerage commission cost. So if the turnover rate is 200%, then you've got 20 basis points, and you've got a 200% additional excess fee. Compare this added hidden cost to a low-cost mutual fund, such as an indexed fund, where the turnover is considerably less. If the employer was aware of the turnover in the fund, he might elect to give his employees more low-indexed funds to choose from rather than highly managed funds.
These fees, are they explicit within a plan's perspective? Is this information accessible to the consumer or to the employee?
The reality is that the information is there. It's a matter of ferreting through the prospectus and through the contracts that the employer enters into with the investment management firm or with the service providers to ascertain exactly what the fees are. Every fund prospectus will provide you with an expense ratio. However, this is usually a bundled fee, so you don't know how much of it represents portfolio turnover, how much represents brokerage commission rates, how much represents soft dollar arrangements, or how much of it is administrative. And there is no requirement under ERISA currently, and the courts have so far held to this idea that there is no fiduciary obligation to disclose in an unbundled fashion all of these fees.
let's follow up on the courts, as you mentioned.
Okay.
In recent years, there's been a tremendous amount of money being spent on legal costs that are being paid out to defend lawsuits that revolve around unacceptable fees for 401k plans. Some of these fees have actually reached the $1 million mark, if I remember correctly. How are these fees passed on to a plan participant?
Well, they're not. ERISA prohibits the defense of a fiduciary claim from being paid by through the use of plan assets or the participant's account balances. But it does put an enormous burden on board of directors and on other fiduciaries within companies to get that money to pay to defend these suits. Largely that's taken care of through indemnification, through insurance, sometimes a tie-in, since some of this is related to securities issues, a tie-in to the company's D&O. But the plan participants per se are not the basis for the payment for these litigations.
From your experience, do you see that employers are providing the unbiased or non-biased information to plan participants that would really be part and parcel of a fiduciary responsibility? It bothers me a bit that you say that all these expenses are bundled, which means that if I have a plan and let's say it's 5% of the fees, you don't know of that 5% who gets each piece. But based upon your explanation, it appears that everybody that touches this plan is getting a piece of the pie.
That's a very good point, Mark. Yes, a lot of people get a piece of the pie. And the real question for a fiduciary, and of course for the Department of Labor and for the plan participants, is that an earned piece of the pie? I mean, if you're providing a service, then you expect to get reasonable compensation. But when it's bundled up, you don't know whether you're really getting the service for which you're being assessed.
So, Miriam, when benefit managers turn to third parties to advise them about managing the plan, the fiduciary chain of command continues, I assume, because everybody has responsibility. What is the potential downside when these benefit managers are using these independent third parties in relation to the entire plan in totality?
Well, there is no clear fiduciary chain. So some folks are fiduciaries and others are not. The employer, the board of directors, fund administrators are your most important fiduciaries. When you retain an outside consultant or even service providers, some of them will fight very hard in their contractual arrangement with the plan sponsor to avoid the designation of fiduciary status. And that's the reason why you've got record keepers, certain custodial trustees, certain independent consultants that you refer to not being fiduciary. So they have no obligation to provide any more information than is required under the Investment Act of 1940 or under other SEC regulations. But under ERISA, they do not hold the title of fiduciary unless they have the ability to exercise complete discretionary control over the assets. So getting an independent third party in to advise is usually a good idea, but you have to bear in mind, is that independent third party consultant then one of the persons I'm also paying something to in this bundled arrangement because that person has an arrangement with the service provider or an affiliate of the service provider. And so there is kind of a network of persons who work around a plan who work with each other. So you have to be sure that your independent third-party consultant is in fact independent and not being paid off, for example, a float or some other revenue sharing measure.